Hi, I'm Miss Hattie from Olympian High School. I'll be using the Traditions and Encounters textbook by Dr. Bentley on page 246, chapter 10, to try to help you understand about the economy of the Greeks from the ancient days, from the classical period. So first, let's take a look in the book at this heading that says the fruits of trade. The fruits of anything is usually a reference to the positives, the benefits of something. And here it's telling you about its effects on the Greek economy and on Greek society. So if you take a look at this introductory section, it's telling you about what Greece was like. I've traveled to Greece, so if we're taking a look, here's where we are in the United States, and then we go all the way to Africa. Then we're going to look here. Now, nowadays, there's a country called Greece, but back then, it was not one unified country, and you looked at the earlier chapters, so you know about the history of Greece from, Minoan to Mycenaean society, and then you know about how the Greeks colonized different regions, so they colonized in what used to be called Anatolia or Turkey. So despite the fact that, and then we know that Philip of Macedon takes over, and then Alexander of Macedon is there, and then after Alexander you have what are called the Hellenistic empires from the word Hellas or Greece. Okay, so you don't have political unification, meaning it's not just one country back then in the time that we're studying, but the Greeks, wherever they lived, whether they were living in what we think of as Greece today, or if they were living in Anatolia, or if they were living in a colony outside of this region, somewhere along the Mediterranean Sea, they had things in common and they continued to trade with each other. So what we want to understand is that they are culturally similar, they're culturally in communication, and Greece is also a very mountainous area, so it makes it difficult to get around. So overland trade is going to be more expensive than maritime trade. Maritime from the word mare or mare, it means ocean. So we're going to see Greek people being very active in maritime trade networks. So the other thing that you should know before we start is what the word prosperity means. The word prosperity is just the condition of being economically successful, being wealthy, having money. And then, of course, you all know about grapes. My favorite, cotton candy grapes. And you also know about olives. And you know that you can make things from grapes and olives, like, for example, wine from grapes and olive oil. And those are from olives, which these are the two major commodities I want you to associate with Greeks. So if you're taking notes on an inspect chart, this information would be mostly under the economics section. You could put it in any of the boxes. Of course, you have multiple inspect charts that you might be creating for the different societies, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, Spartans, Athenians, or any of the other Greek polis, or when Philip was there, or when Alexander or Macedon was there, or for when there were any of the Hellenistic empires that came after Alexander. So you can put this economic information in any of those sections. For the most part, it's not super important where you put it as long as you put it under the economic section. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a mountainous region with rocky soil, so it makes it very difficult to grow certain or cultivate certain items. And you know that the Greeks are therefore going to largely depend on maritime trade. It tells you that that the landscape is well suited for the growth of or the cultivation of olives and grapes. It tells you that they concentrated on growing olive oil or cultivating olive oil and wine, producing olive oil and wine, and they traded these items around the Mediterranean. By the early 8th century BCE, which is the 700s BCE, this had generated significant prosperity in the Greek world, and that merchants linked or connected Greek communities throughout the Mediterranean world. So not just in the area that we think of as Greece, but all throughout that Mediterranean region where the colonies were. And this population growth is going to lead to further colonization. Here you should study this in more detail. This is telling you specifically which items are being traded with which regions. And I'll let you take notes on that specifically, but make sure you take a look at what's coming from where. One thing that might surprise you is that slaves were coming from Egypt and Russia. So traditionally, students aren't accustomed to thinking of slaves as being, quote unquote, white or however you want to describe the concept of race. But you want to think that there were many slaves coming from this region. This is important for us as we continue to study the evolution of slavery, the global trade of slaves. There were huge ships that were carrying a large cargo, large capacity ships. And this is part of their technology, right? They had ships that could have a capacity of 400 tons, some for even 1,000 tons. And some cities actually depended more on trade than on agriculture, which is the traditional way that we think of people supporting themselves, a traditional livelihood, as being a farmer. But some cities depended more on trade, commercial activities. So you want to make sure you write that down in the, if you're doing an inspect chart, the other Greek cities column or the one on Athens. So this is going to have an effect. And one of the effect of this massive amount of trade is it's going to promote more complicated types of commercial and economic organization. So you're going to see more complexity, things becoming more complicated. One of those types of complexities or more complex forms of economic organization is called a partnership. And in the book, it'll describe to you what the partnership looked like. But basically, a merchant or somebody who's selling something might borrow money from a banker or someone else and then buy commodities, buy cargo, rent space from a ship. But if there was a shipwreck, then the merchant and the lender were both left to absorb the losses or basically lose their money. On the ships that we've discussed, there were many manufactured goods aboard. Most of the manufacturers were small time. They had not very many employees, although there are examples of pottery makers, pottery workshops that employed over 60 people, sometimes 120 people. But these were largely small businesses. Trade connected the Greek cities to other Greeks in the larger Mediterranean communities. And so they had a lot of similar culture. For example, they recognized the same Greek gods, even though they spoke slightly different languages, they had different dialects. They could communicate with their quote-unquote cousins, and they would gather from time to time in what are called pan-Hellenic festivals. So pan means all, and Hellenic comes from the word Hellas, which just means Greek. So all the Greeks together festivals. And the most famous festival was the Olympic Games. So according to tradition, every 4 years, starting in 776, for about 1,000 years or a millennium, people would, from all the different Greek communities, would send their best athletes to compete in different kinds of events. And obviously the winners would bring glory to their specific city. And this was also a way of bringing all the Greeks together. So it was a way of unifying themselves culturally, even though they were not united politically. Give them a sense of collective identity. Think of that as an effect. Obviously, when Philip of Macedon takes over the Greek areas, and then Alexander of Macedon continues that conquest, and then he dies, and then you have the Hellenistic empires. The Hellenistic empires are much larger. So this is going to bring the Greek colonists, or the Greeks in general, into further communication and commercial exchange with other lands. One of the things, so it's going to link them to Persia and Bactria, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan. One of the things I really need you to understand that's a little complicated is that overland trade at that time was more difficult and therefore more expensive than trade over maritime routes. So since overland routes are more expensive, you only want to take things overland that can give you a lot of bang for your buck. So for example, gold, something that is small but gives you a high profit, that would be carried overland. Anything that is large but doesn't make you a large profit, that should go over the maritime trade routes because it's cheaper to send things over water. So basically think of this. If it's going over land, it has to be really expensive. And if it's going over the water, it should be something where you're not going to generate a big profit. So the way this is worded in your book is here, and it's just telling you overland is where you're going to see luxury items such as gems and jewelry, perfumes, aromatic oils, because they all had high value relative to their weight. So compared to their weight, they gave you a lot of profit. Okay, so this is some of the information that you should know about maritime trade that took place during the classical period of Greece. And in the next video, I'll tell you about social effects of trade and Greek society in general.